بسم الله الحمد لله الصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Doing a short video which is very similar to one I did a few weeks ago, which I've had to take down for obvious reasons. The reason I'm doing this is because when I discuss with some people, they genuinely get confused over where the role of Zionism is strong and where the role of colonialism is strong, where they overlap, where they clash. And that debate has been going on for many, many decades, and it actually carries on till the present day. So the presentation that I prepared, titled The Occupation of Palestine, Is it Zionism or Colonialism? Or perhaps it's a bit of both, is one that addresses some of that. And some of you will have seen this material in other presentations I've done in the last few months. So, Bismillah. You will see, particularly in social media amongst Muslims, there's this big focus on Zionism. Why? Well, obviously the ruling authority, the occupying authority in Palestine is Zionist, and the defense of the actions, the genocide that's going on is done by the Zionist regime there. And a lot of the most genocidal rhetoric is coming from Zionists. Less focus on the colonial aspect. When I say the colonial aspect of the occupation, I mean the fact that the Zionist occupation is actually something encouraged by Western colonial powers. People who've studied the history do understand this, and I'm going to go through both aspects separately, and then really try and tie it up to explain a little bit of what we see at the end. So let's have a look at Zionist aims. This slide I've used before. It's a summary of the way things were towards the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century in Europe. Zionism, in the end, is a response to European anti-Semitism. These slides demonstrate different aspects of that. So in the middle here, what you have is a poster, public demonstration in Britain in 1902, which is questioning about the fact that Jewish refugees were coming over to Britain in large numbers. Sounds very familiar, I'm afraid. This is a 1905 Act of Parliament called the Alien Act, which was brought in by the government of Arthur Balfour, later Lord Balfour. Balfour was a prime minister before he was foreign secretary later. When he was prime minister, he brought in this act, which was in order to try and prevent the migration of Jews who were being persecuted, mainly in Eastern Europe and Russia, from coming to Britain and seeking refuge here. This is kind of like their stop the boats policy of those days. And then you have a more kind of like representatives of these pogroms that were happening in Eastern Europe and in Russia, where Jewish communities were being persecuted. This is an example on the right-hand side of a very famous case in the late 1800s, early 1900s of Alfred Dreyfus, who was a Jewish officer in the French army who was convicted of treason and sent to Devil's Island on the basis of very little evidence and tried in secret courts. Later emerged that he was innocent of the charges that he was accused of. But the anti-Semitism that went with that in France was massive, and it had reverberations across the whole of Europe, that this French soldier officer was actually really, sentenced for treason on trumped up charges. And it fed this idea of Jews being the other, being the foreigner. So that's the situation of the world in Europe. And as is so often the case, what ends up affecting the rest of the world is actually seen through the lens of what's happened in Europe. So in the late 1800s, you have the start of a Zionist movement. And Theodor Herzl was the founder of this. And he had the first Zionist Congress in the late 1800s. And he had his philosophy, which was to try and establish a Jewish homeland somewhere in the world for Jews. He was a secular Jew. He was not a religious Jew. It's very important to say that actually at the early outset of the Zionist movement, these were secular Jews, not religious. In fact, the dominant religious position was that this was anathema to their religion, that to actually try and make an effort to migrate back to Palestine in particular was not something that was in line with their religious beliefs. So these guys were considered innovators or heretics from a religious perspective, but from a political perspective, Herzl, who was a Swiss lawyer, argued that the Jews needed a homeland, somewhere which they could get protection. And the most favored place for this that they had was in Palestine, then under the Ottoman Khilafah, under the Ottoman rule. And he argued that they actually wanted big money from Zionist funders to buy land in Palestine and allow Jews to resettle there. And that was given some partial permission about the settlement of Palestine by the Ottomans. But, statement of Herzl's here in 1895, we must expropriate gently the private property on the estates assigned to us, and we shall try to spirit the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for it in transit countries while denying it employment in our own country. So this idea of getting refugees to settle and to be denied residency in their own countries in order to get settlement in Jewish homeland. And he even argued that this would form part of a wall of defense for Europe in Asia, an outpost of civilization against barbarism. So from the very early days, there was this idea by the Zionists that they could convince European powers in particular that actually this wasn't in their interest to have a outpost of civilization in the Middle East for the West. Herzl, as we know, tried to meet the Ottoman Khalifa, Sultan Abdul Hamid, twice to legitimately buy land, which Abdul Hamid rahmatullahi alayhi refused, saying it was not his land to sell. Weizmann was kind of a later Zionist ruler. He was from Eastern Europe originally and then settled in the UK and lobbied very hard in the UK to see that the Zionist project was adopted, and eventually it was in World War I, as we will see later. But Weizmann was the guy who argued that Palestine was a land without a people, and then there existed the Jewish people who didn't have a land. And he was trying to argue with the Ottomans that actually this would be in mutual interest. But he later on went to describe the fact that the Palestinians are the rocks of Judea, i.e. obstacles that have to be cleared on a difficult path. So this argument of mutual interest was one which was deceptive. Actually, in the end, and the argument that there was no people there is deceptive, because later on he argues that there are Palestinians there and there are obstacles and they have to be cleared. Again, as I say, he argued for a colonial interest in this. He said, should Palestine fall within the British sphere of influence, and should Britain encourage Jewish settlements there as a British dependency, we could have 20 to 30 years' time, 1 million Jews out there, perhaps more, and they would form a very effective guard for the Suez Canal. So he was arguing it in colonial interests. Now, Zionism is not actually of just one color. Herzl, Weizmann, later on Ben-Gurion were of the idea that they wanted a Jewish homeland. They were offered homelands in places like Africa, Uganda particularly. They're offered homeland in South America. In fact, Ben-Gurion was offered a homeland in, I think it was Korea. But Palestine was their favored place. And you can see the argument from a colonial perspective, trying to sell it to the British that this would help them control the Suez Canal, and particularly their trade routes to India. But they were, in those days, in favor of this idea of a two-state solution. They would have a state which they would call Israel, and then there would be a Palestinian state. But in the history of Zionism, by the 1930s, this guy, Vladimir Jabotinsky, in particular, argued for what they call revisionist Zionism, that they had this idea that from the river to the sea would be a greater Israel project. And this is the argument that became dominant. Jabotinsky, there are many pretty bad quotes from this guy. Zionist colonization can proceed and develop only under the protection of a power that is independent of a native population. So he recognized that Zionist colonization needed a powerful backer and broker that would protect it. And in terms of the Palestinians, he said every native population in the world resists colonialists as long as it has the slightest hope of being able to rid itself of the danger of it being colonized. And that is what the Arabs in Palestine are doing. And they will persist in doing so, i.e. resist, as long as there remains a solitary spark of hope that they will be able to prevent the establishment of the land of Israel, as he said. Ben-Gurion was a later leader who believed more in the idea of a two-state solution. This is a quote from him, recognizing that Palestine is not an empty country. And initially he says, on no account what must we injure the rights of the inhabitants. Later saying, we don't recognize the right of the Palestinian Arabs to rule the country since Palestine is still underdeveloped. And, so there's a contradiction here and against a deception here. On the one hand, saying we don't want to injure the interests of the inhabitants. And that was in the early days when they were still migrating over from Europe. And later, basically the Arabs have no right to the Jordan River. They only have a right to that which they have created into their homes. Ben-Gurion, again, believed in the two-state idea. And actually there was this tension between Jabotinsky and Ben-Gurion, to the extent that Jabotinsky, he died, I think, in Europe, and later he wanted his body to be, he'd said he'd wanted his body to be interned in their quote-unquote Jewish state, and Ben-Gurion actually opposed that when he was the leader of the occupation later on. There was that tension between them, political and personal. As I said, not all Jewish people believed in Zionism. In fact, in the early days prior to World War II, the majority position of religious Jews was this was a kind of heresy. And there are still a small but important number of very vocal Jewish people who oppose the Zionist project and occupation. And these are photographs of some from recent years, but they were the dominant and majority position until probably World War II and the increased persecution of Jewish people in Europe. So as we've seen, the Zionists lobbied Britain, France, and the United States. Ben-Gurion actually went to the United States in the 1940s to try and secure US support for the Zionist occupation. And they seized a window of opportunity in World War I, which was Weizmann that did that. After the war, they did not believe that the West would keep their part of the deal. Some were what you could call gradualists who believed in this two states. That was the Herzl, Weizmann, Ben-Gurion kind of argument, and some were the more radical revisionist Zionists who believed in a one Jewish state dominating from the river to the sea, and that was the Jabotinsky argument. Actually, what happened was the British held a mandate after World War I, in which they were controlling Palestine. They had put in proxy rulers into Jordan, or Transjordan, it was called then, and Syria, later to be ruled by client rulers loyal to the French, and same in Lebanon. British had client rulers in Egypt and in Iraq. And through this, the British mandate continued till the 1940s. And in that period, we saw the rise of the Jewish population in the region from about 60 to 80,000 before World War I to about 800,000 by the 1940s, and a large proportion of them came from Europe. The British facilitated large numbers to come over from Europe, and a large proportion of them came from other parts of the Arab world where Zionists were creating dissent in the Arab world such that Arab Jews would flee to Palestine thinking they were going to get some kind of refuge. And there's good documentary evidence for that. When the British mandate was due to expire in May 1948, the Zionists declared their own state unilaterally, And the US recognized it the same day, the Soviets recognized it the same week, but the United Nations only the following year. But what that represents is the tension between the great powers at the time, the United States and the Soviet Union, both of whom wanted to invest some support in this Zionist project to have influence within the Middle East. In that period of the British Mandate, we saw the rise of militias and terrorist groups, Zionist terrorist groups. First of all, the Haganah, which was the armed brigade which Ben-Gurion led. Then the wing that was affected by the Jabotinsky revisionist Zionism formed a more extreme group called the Irgun, and a break-off of that indeed formed the Stern Gang, or Lehi was later called. Irgun and Lehi were responsible for many attacks, most famously the terrorist attack on the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, where British troops were stationed. Actually, Irgun eventually morphed into what is today's Likud. And Lehi, leaders of Lehi, so the Irgun had the leader, one of the leaders of Irgun was Menachem Begin, who was later a leader of the Zionist occupation under the Likud party. Lehi, one of their foremost leaders, was Yitzhak Shamir, who was later another leader in the Zionist occupying force. By 1948, the Zionists had organized not just politically, but militarily, where the Palestinians were specifically prevented from doing that by the British, which then allowed the Zionists to launch the Nakba, the eradication of 500 Palestinian villages and its populations, either killing people in huge numbers or sending them into exile. Between 750,000 and 900,000 Palestinian men, women, and children were driven out, and 500 villages were completely wiped out in that period of months, commonly known as the Nakba, the catastrophe. The impact of that goes on today. And one thing we can say is that the politics of the occupation have definitely changed. The majority opinion across the political spectrum there, 80 to 90% of the political spectrum, follows the view of needing a greater Israel, which occupies from the river to the sea, and the Arabs basically are relocated. That's a majority opinion, even amongst what they call the center-left. There is a minority opinion that believes in the philosophy of a two-state in the political elite in that place. And we see this played out in the atrocities committed in Gaza and the genocidal rhetoric coming right from the top. So the president of the occupation, Herzl, he says that, there are no innocent civilians in Gaza, and the population there has been calling for a massacre in Gaza and celebrating that Gaza is going to be a cemetery. And we see the rhetoric from the politicians, whether Herzog, Netanyahu, and others, actually filtering down to the troops on the ground. It's not just in Gaza, of course. Over the last few years, we've seen increasing incursions into Al-Masjid al-Aqsa and Al-Quds and violations there. We've seen the destruction of houses in East Jerusalem and the furthering occupation and settlements in the West Bank. This map shows the West Bank. The green areas are the areas which the Palestinians have full control over, even though nominally the West Bank is under the leadership of the Palestinian Authority. But the pink areas show the areas of Israeli military control in the region, which shows you effectively the West Bank is being colonized as well. So what you've seen in the last 4 months is the eradication of Palestinians from Gaza, either killed or ethnically cleansed, and you've seen a rise in the settlement activity in the West Bank, trying to get more Palestinians to leave and take over their land. And actually, the current Zionist vision was represented by Netanyahu at the UN before this crisis broke out in October, whereby he showed a map of what he calls Israel in the new Middle East, which he saw the vision of this Israel, where there's no Palestine on the map, effectively, has independent relations with Egypt, with Sudan, with Saudi Arabia, with the UAE, with Turkey, with all these players in the region which are backing it, basically. This is effectively the Zionist vision that has played out till today. Now, why do I want to talk about colonialism? Well, I said the Zionists actually wanted very much to try and have sell their project to colonialists, that it would represent their interests. And they did indeed manage to do that, and the colonialists recognized this. So in World War I, November 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour wrote to Lord Rothschild, who represented the Zionist community, saying that the British would support a homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine, various conditions saying that it would actually not jeopardize the interests of the existing population. 1 month later, the British managed to march into Jerusalem and occupy Jerusalem directly, and that transformed after the war into the mandate that the League of Nations gave the British to rule over that till 1948. That change in the region was part of a wider change. So the British managed to secure the occupation of Jerusalem by inspiring Sharif Hussein in Mecca to rebel against the Ottomans as a traitor and to create a second front of war for the Ottomans, which would mean that they had resources stretched. And in doing that, he allied with Lawrence of Arabia. And in doing that, the Ottomans were weaker in the Hijaz and in Ash-Sham, and they eventually lost Hijaz and Ash-Sham, and Baghdad as well. So Jerusalem, Damascus, Baghdad were all lost, and various other places within the region. And there, Sharif Hussein took control over the Hijaz himself. With the promise of things to come after the war, his sons inherited the kingdoms of Iraq and Egypt and Jordan. The British divided up the Middle East with the French during the war, nominally called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the idea being the British took Jordan and Iraq, and the French would take Syria and Lebanon, and that the Palestine area would be under international control, but the British eventually got it anyway after the war. And through the post-war negotiations and the crisis in what was left of the Ottoman state, the Khilafah was abolished in 1924. So there was a huge geopolitical shake-up in the region which preceded the establishment of the Zionist entity there. Britain, why did they want Palestine? Well, Lord Curzon, former foreign minister, former viceroy of India, statesman of Britain in the 1920s, in a speech to the House of Lords, he argued that actually if Britain had Palestine, they had control in the Middle East for distinct military and strategic objectives, meaning India predominantly. This was the jewel in Britain's crown. The resources from India would come to help the City of London. Another British statesman, a former Governor General of Jerusalem, was Sir Ronald Restores, who in his memoir said that Britain wanted a little loyal Jewish Ulster, meaning a colony in the Middle East where they changed the demographics, as they did in Northern Ireland, to have a Jewish representative state representing Britain's colonial interests in the Middle East. Remember what Weitzman said about helping to control the Suez Canal. But Britain actually recognized that this was a common interest, but the Zionists did have their own ends. Britain wanted a satellite colony. Later, that would be the Americans as the dominant power that would want that to protect their interests, and a place that they could effectively relocate Jews out of Europe. Yeah, sounds pretty disgusting, but it is. But those of us that live in Britain that hear the rhetoric about refugees, migrants, minorities can understand how that kind of rhetoric could arise in Europe, or that kind of plan and vision could arise in Europe. But there's also a attempt to influence the Zionist lobby in World War I. The British felt that by promising Palestine, maybe that would favorably affect the Zionist lobby in America, for America to enter into World War I. It was also in line with the Christian Zionist beliefs of a few of the politicians, like Lloyd George, But ultimately, the British recognized that colonial interests and Zionist interests were not the same. Curzon, writing to Balfour in 1919, says Weizmann, the leader of the World Zionist movement, contemplates a Jewish state, a Jewish nation, a subordinate population of Arabs, and Weizmann was trying to effect this behind the screen and under the shelter of British trusteeship. So they want a colony, and Weizmann and the Zionists want their own independent power. Harry Truman, a former American president, in a video that you can find on YouTube of him talking about the colonization of Palestine, talks about how we had to do this in small doses. You cannot move 5 or 6 million people out of a country and fill it up with 5 or 6 million people more and expect both sides of them to be pleased. Eventually, we will have them all satisfied. Well, his idea was that you would move the Arabs out and move the Zionist population in. Alexander Haig, former American Secretary of State, was once quoted as saying, Israel is the largest American aircraft carrier in the world that cannot be sunk, and it doesn't even carry one American soldier, is located in a critical region for American national security. So he recognizes it as a colony. And indeed, what you can see is that the American vision, this is actually a map, I've used it before, it's not an official map. Ralph Peters is an American military strategist who used to teach, and this was his vision of the Middle East, but it's a classic divide and rule policy. So what started with Sykes-Picot in World War I, dividing up the Middle East into different borders, the American vision is, well, you know, look, you can divide it up even further and actually dominate the region. And part of that domination is about having this colonial entity they call Israel in the Middle East as their baby. And that is represented by the amount of military and financial aid and political cover that they give this entity. And we can all see that in the Gaza onslaught, that actually this could not happen without the Americans arming and rearming. This could not happen without Anthony Blinken going round to all their proxy agent rulers in the Muslim world saying, don't do anything, wait for the war to stop, then have a normalization under the Abraham Accords, which will benefit all of you financially. That's their argument, basically. So this, in turn, shows some of what you can say is the kind of contradictory statements that and actions that you see with what's going on there. So on the one hand, Biden, Blinken, Sunak, Macron, all of them saying, the EU, all saying Israel has a right to defend itself and an obligation to defend itself, and effectively giving political license to the genocide that we've seen and turning a blind eye to the genocidal rhetoric, I should say, turning a deaf ear to the genocidal rhetoric and a blind eye to the genocide that's happening, and repeatedly saying as a lie, basically, that they believe that what they're doing is in line with their own international law. And then later on, when they think that their proxy colonial Zionist occupation is getting out of hand, they start a rhetoric which is trying to rein it back in. So Biden just this week saying that the Gaza response was over the top. Similarly, the rhetoric about Palestinian state, well, it's not real. I've done another video that talks about the two-state solution, but you've had Cameron recently coming out saying the US and UK may recognize a Palestinian state, and Biden saying the same thing, that they can envisage something which could be some part of a new future in the region. And you can see that Biden issues an executive order against Israeli settlers in the West Bank. So this seems like a stoke up of the rhetoric, even though the guy, Genocide Joe, as he's called nowadays, was supporting the massacres. On the other hand, the response from Netanyahu is no Palestinian state. And here you have, and you don't really hear much of a resistance to that in the occupying authority, in the Zionist occupying authority. And this represents that two different visions, the Zionist vision that effectively wants a one state for itself and to be an independent power in the region, that it would actually have broker relationships with Saudi, with UAE, with Sudan, with Egypt, with Turkey, and they would all benefit economically, and that because of the extra aid this colony gets from the United States, it would be militarily more powerful and economically more influential in the region. And the US colonial vision, its aircraft carrier in the region, the inheritors of Britain who talked about a little loyal Zionist, little loyal Jewish Ulster in the region, who want their colony to be under their control. And that tension plays out till today. It is the number one security interest for the Americans in the world today. They had hoped that their Abraham Accords would bring some kind of peace. They were throwing the Palestinians under a bus completely, but they had thought that they would bring some kind of peace in the region. And actually, what they have found is that as they were trying to relocate their center of gravity in foreign policy towards Southeast Asia, they have been dragged back into trying to sort something out in the Middle East. But it is their number one policy interest there, and they cannot afford to let it go under. And that is why you will see this tension play out with the West wanting a colony, the Zionists wanting their own independence, and in between the Palestinian people who are being occupied, murdered, ethnically cleansed, used as a political football, with nobody, not even the rulers in the Muslim world, not the armies that are capable of rescuing them, nobody helping them. They are the victims in this. They are the ones where those people who are capable of liberating them need to go in and rescue them. That's how this is played out. And I hope that was a useful explainer to try and understand some of this politics. And yeah, as I say, I've been through quite a lot of it before in other places, but for obvious reasons, I'm having to re-record some of this stuff because that material isn't available. Hope that's helpful. وصلى الله على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين والحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم.